We have 5 reasons why we're skeptical. First, important historical counterexamples contradict the view. The Federal Reserve, long considered to be one of the most independent central banks in this de jure sense, played a key role in the, just to leave the post-Depression era, in the great inflation from 1965 to 1985. Meanwhile, the Bank of Japan, which is in fact one of the world's most dependent central banks in the de jure sense, that is not independent, up to 1998 anyway, generated an impressive record of price stability during that period. From 1950 on. Get my watch up here. So we have these 2 big counterexamples. And by the way, as the Bank of Japan has become more legally independent, it's become more de facto dependent on the government. Second, detailed analysis of the policy record of the Federal Reserve suggests far more political sensitivity than the modern view acknowledges. Meltzer's history of the Fed demonstrates the Fed's sensitivity to political institutions despite its supposed independent status, and the diary of Arthur Burns, which Meltzer did not cite, reinforces this view. Likewise, detailed analysis of Bank of Japan policy since 1998 indicates that as it gained more, as I already said, as it gains more de jure independence, it loses de facto independence. Third, we think the time inconsistency literature suggests that the case for optimal price stability outcomes from de jure independent banks with multiple goals is questionable. Friedman also stressed that independent central banks are also likely to be the source of monetary instability. There were methodological issues that which Tom Cargill especially has taken up in his independent papers. And finally, let's be commonsensical. Central banks are established by governments. Governments respond to political interest. It's hard to make this case that the central bank can, in ordinary circumstance, insulate this from itself from this. Well, I think what I want to do, we have a lot of stuff on the origin of central banks, and I think the people who know the historical literature of the origin of central banks know their origin was in the problem of fiscal problems that governments had, and they were created for that purpose. The Bank of England is illustrative of that. It started out as a fiscal instrumentality to benefit the king and the government, and it became, and there was obviously no concept of monetary policy in the 17th century. It became a central bank because of monopolies that were given to it, and other historical examples reinforce that view. In many ways, the Fed is different. It's a different story. It's a story that has to do with what was viewed at the time as an unstable banking system. I think Jeff Myron's charts kind of call the significance of that into question. In any case, it would have been very easy to fix the issues, the problems, with the national banking system, the post-Civil War banking system, no central bank, a private issuance of currency by national banks. The problems with that system were understood at the time. The fixes weren't complicated. The creation of the Fed was not a necessary condition to solve that financial instability we saw, which, as we saw, did not keep the U.S. from growing very rapidly historically. But at least I view, and I kind of Tom kind of let me get this idea into the paper, the Fed was really part of a progressive agenda to gain control, government influence over the financial system. It had no monetary policy role when it was created because we were on the gold standard. That role came along only after, well, as Alan Meltzer said, World War I. Now, what I want to do is jump ahead, because this is really the core of the debate. The Accord of 1951 between the Treasury and the Fed, where the Fed no longer had to engage in price support of the Treasury bonds, that is, fixing interest rates, is viewed as the watershed event in this independence literature, and the performance of the Fed in the 1950s is viewed as confirming the importance of the Fed's gaining independence in this sense. But let us realize that it wasn't independent. It didn't gain independence because what happened right after the Accord was signed? The Fed the Federal Reserve Chairman McCabe, was forced to resign several days later by Truman, who simply sent him a letter and said, your services are no longer satisfactory, despite the fact that he had a legal term that lasted until 1956. And secondly, if this is the defining moment in which the Fed gained its independence, then because it no longer had to support the price of Treasury securities, then I submit to you that I almost could stop right here, because since we now have a policy of supporting the price of Treasury securities, it must, by logic, mean that Bernanke ended the Fed's independence. I could stop here, but let me go on a little bit. I'll use up some more of my time. Okay. Now, we also have a discussion in here of whether it is possible for the Fed to be de jure independent. And our argument is, under the Constitution, it actually can't be. And the legal doctrine is that no delegated power can be further delegated. So there's a whole problem with this literature in which the Fed is pictured as de jure independent. Rather, most of my talk is going to be, the remaining part of my talk is going to be on the question of de facto independence. And to kind of give you the bottom line is, it waxes and wanes, as kind of we've already heard from Alan Meltzer's paper. We encourage economists to adhere to the modern view of independence, to study the history of the Federal Reserve, particularly under both McChesney Martin and Arthur Burns. The price stability of the 1950s did appear consistent with the independent central bank hypothesis. However, Martin had little problem shifting to a more supportive role of the government as the government drifted into more active Keynesian policies under Kennedy and Johnson, and then, of course, the Vietnam War. Burns, when he came on the board with strong academic credentials, continued the Martin tradition of viewing Federal Reserve independence as independence within government, and throughout the 1970s conducted policies during the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations with the same political sensitivity. So we very much support the view of Meltzer on this point. Now, Volcker is widely credited, and deservedly so, with restoring the Fed's reputation and winning the fight against inflation, and we agree. But remember, the reason he was able to do this is he had the support of Reagan. And Reagan threw his support behind him. Schultz and others convinced the president if they didn't end inflation, the Reagan administrations would end in tatters. It wouldn't have a program. It couldn't have a program. So, yeah, Volcker gained independence from congressional criticism, popular criticism, by becoming dependent on the support of the executive branch. We also agree in our paper that Greenspan more or less followed in the Volcker tradition of, because he was adhering to a rule that he evolved called the Taylor Rule, he was able to operate independently to a great degree, but then he broke the rule. And what's Greenspan's own judgment on what was going on and what the Fed's role, his role, was in the government? When he testified in April 2010 to the Financial Crisis Commission, he was reported as the following. He argued that if the Federal Reserve had tried to slow the housing market, amid a broad consensus about encouraging home ownership, the Congress would have clamped down on us. So much for independence. Now, what is the source of the problem? Could the Fed be more independent de facto? It has de facto from time to time. In some sense, Volcker acted independently, but it only can act independently when it follows a rule. Again, a point that's already come out here. The emphasis on the short run is the systemic failure of the Federal Reserve, long noted by historians. The failure to forecast the Great Recession seems to me to undermine any claim the Federal Reserve is able to successfully engage in discretionary macroeconomic policies. So it should, as a practice, follow a rule. In any case, if it wants this political independence, a rule is the only thing that can give it to it. Okay, let me then quickly, all right, let's go. Okay, so how do we end up in this paper? As follows, and I'll be able to do this very quickly. At no time has the Federal Reserve, or we think any central bank, been entirely free of political pressure. Sometimes it seeks the protection of one branch of government to insulate itself from another. This is in the context of the US system, Volcker and Reagan. It thus makes itself more dependent in one sense to become more independent in another sense. In any case, over any long period of time, such as the post-Accord period, there's just no way you can blanket categorize the Fed, or I think any other central bank, as having been either independent or dependent for the entire period. As I've said already, it waxes and wanes. The problem of the empirical literature is that it often attributes good performances to central banks that were not independent in fact, and vice versa. The years in which the Federal Reserve might be said to have operated independently are comparatively few in number and do not encompass the whole post-Accord era. The idea that the Federal Reserve Bank was independent in any consistent or coherent sense over this period is myth rather than reality, and we suggest that's probably true for most central banks. Thank you.